It's now time to talk about what's going on in the Canadian grocery market. We're talking to Kevin Grier. He's with Kevin Grier Market Analysis and Consulting. He's based out of Guelph, Ontario. Kevin, how's it going?
Good. Thanks for having me on.
Hey, great to chat with you. Okay, hey, Kevin, let's start off. With inflation. You know, there's a lot of talk about interest rates right now. Which way they're moving. Definitely, the sentiment is lower, not higher at this point in 2019 on both sides of the border. But what's happening in terms of food inflation in Canada?
Right. Well, it's starting to raise its head, so to speak, because I think you and I have talked about this in the past. Canadian food inflation has been very, very moderate, and at times in the last 3 years, we've actually had deflation of our food prices. And again, I always say it's hard for people to actually believe that, but we have. Particularly in 2016 and into 2017, we've had food inflation declining. In other words, year over year, we actually paid less. Now, however, Sean, in the last few months, we've had inflation of started off about 1%, 2%, and actually in March, we had food from store inflation of 4%, which is really, really high. We haven't had that high since about early 2016. So we're starting to see that, and that's particularly interesting. That compares, Sean, to all items. In other words, everything that we buy, from gasoline through to shoes, clothing, of less than 2%.
Okay, so what's driving that? Is that because of increased input costs, increased cost of goods, and grocery stores having to increase their prices, or are costs holding and they're just increasing their prices to get more margin?
That's a great question, because in my view, there's two things that do drive prices, and that is A, the underlying costs, and in particular underlying commodity costs of whether it's cattle or vegetables, and number two, competition. If they are competing vigorously, chances are we're going to have very, very low inflation. So those two factors are very important. First thing, Sean, is that it's extraordinary increases in fresh vegetable prices. And, I'm not a vegetable analyst. I like to think of myself as knowledgeable about the meat industry, but there's huge increases in vegetable prices at the retail level, but it's being driven by big increases at the producer level down in the United States. So I think there are production problems with veggies, but I'm not really sure exactly what the real problem is. But vegetable inflation has been increasing by 10, 15, sometimes closer to 20%. And vegetables are a very important part of the overall food CPI. Fresh fruits and vegetables are almost 20%. So where they go, it pulls a lot of weight. There has been, of course, inflation on some of the meats, the red meats anyway. So that's been driving it as well. But there's also been inflation in the middle of the store. In other words, the packaged goods, and that's one of my indicators that I use for the level of competition between grocers, because Heinz ketchup or Oreos are the same product basically, whether it's a no frills or a high end Thrifties somewhere. So the only way you can compete with those products is with price. So they're starting to raise as well. Their inflation on those items has been up about 2%. So it's being caused by commodities, in particular veggies, but it's also just maybe, there's a little bit of a lessening of competition out there as well.
At the same time, though, we're seeing increased competition for grocers. So when we talk about grocers, we talk about Loblaws or Kroger's or Albertsons in the United States. But they're facing intense competition from non-traditional players, Costco, Walmart, and the competition's heating up in that regard. They're losing some ground.
They sure are. StatsCan has got a quarterly data set that shows the share or the channels of which food is sold. So food is sold through gas stations, Canadian Tire, as well as obviously the grocery stores and convenience stores, drug stores. So StatsCan breaks it out in terms of the food from stores, food store sales, and for example the general merchandisers. And the general merchandisers would be primarily the Walmarts and the Costco. They're the ones that really sell the most food from the general merchandisers. Bottom line there, Sean, is according to the StatsCan data, is that these general merchandisers, Walmart and Costco, are really stealing some share. The food stores, grocers, typically mostly supermarkets, they had about 85% of food sales about not that long ago. Now it's down to 75%. So that's huge, because that means every quarter they're losing $1 billion or so in food sales alone. So there's competition there. There's dynamics, and a lot of people think there's not a lot of competition in grocery, but I totally disagree with that. You've got the three main grocers, then you've of Loblaw, Sobeys, and Metro, and then you've got the regional grocers such as you have in the West of the federated co-ops. Then you've got a large number of independents, ethnic, and then you've got again these general merchandisers. So there's an awful lot of competition. So anybody says there isn't, I would strongly disagree with that.
Yeah. And we're approaching here, we're about 10 days away from, really, for beef sales in particular, a real flagship weekend. Then that is the May long weekend in Canada. It happens next week. What is that still as important of a sale weekend as it was, say, 15, 20 years ago? Because me personally, I'm barbecuing year round. So what break it down for us.
Well, I think if you were to talk to a grocer, they would say that it is one of the biggest weekends of the year, this Victoria Day weekend coming up, in terms of they want to set the tone for the whole barbecue season, and this is where you set the tone. Yeah, you're right. Many Canadians barbecue year round, but in terms of the signal of the beginning of the grilling season, this is really it. And each and every one of them wants to be the one that wins, so to speak, that weekend. They want to be the one that has the flyer out there that really drives the traffic. And there's meat is the destination item. It is the item that, people will decide to go to some place because of the meat, because of the meat ad, because, many people are going to go somewhere strictly because of that. And so the grocer wants to have the best possible feature on that front page of the flyer. I think you and I talked about this about a couple of years ago. Walmart, so-called, blew everybody away for that Victoria weekend. I think they had something like a 577 strip loin, bone-in strip loin, and it was like, oh boy, So you don't want to be caught with say a rib on your front page that's $1 higher than the guide. This is very important because, like I say, it sets the tone, and you set the tone with meat. You don't set it with Oreos or King Dongs. You set it with meat.
Yeah, you're not leading into the Victoria Day weekend with Cocoa Puffs. Okay.
No. And I know, Sean, that you might turn your car around if that was on the flyer, but most Canadians would not.
Only ice cream sandwiches. Only ice cream sandwiches. Hey, okay, so as we go into next weekend, we've been hearing a lot about ASF and what the global supply of pork is, and lots of concerns there from two Canadian packers in terms of getting into China. Is there a chance we see pork featured at all next weekend in comparison to beef, or is it really a beef weekend?
No, you're going to see pork. They would have had their ads planned about 8 weeks ago. They might have got that pork bought about 6 weeks ago. So maybe those ads have not been totally impacted by the Chinese African swine fever. But the bottom line with regard to Chinese African swine fever and its impact is that it is causing grocers to pull their pork ads. In other words, if they had a pork ad planned, they're going to say, no, we're not going to do that because the A, availability is down, or B, the prices are so high. So either A, they're pulling those ads, Sean, or B, they're, instead of going, say, $2.99 on those back ribs, they're going to go $4.99. Because, at least in Eastern Canada, when they're blowing out back ribs, they're going to blow them out for $2.99, $3.99 tops. So they're going to say, you know what, if we can't do that, it's not worth going $4.99. So they're going to still have pork on this one because it might have already been bought and paid for by the time these pork prices started skyrocketing. But no, it is. But I think going into, say, Father's Day or Dominion Day, I think those pork ads you're not going to see them so much. But so pork is important. But yeah, it's primarily beef. Whether you admit it or not, it would be beef. You're going to see, but you're also going to see some $3.99 boneless breast as well.
What kind of margins do they target? We talk a lot here about farmer margins and packer margins, but what about the grocers on some of that beef that is being retailed? What kind of margins are they looking for?
Well, say for example, on Victoria Day, and when I say this, I'm not saying this to say the poor grocer. No, I'm not saying the poor grocer. But on some of those items that you're going to see, they're not going to be making any margin whatsoever. They're going to be so-called investing in it, which is grocer talk for losing on it. So they may be buying it from the packer, negotiating from the packer at one price, and it could even be lower than that, or at the very least netting out nothing. And again, it's not to say, the poor grocer, and I'm not saying that. The bottom line is that's how important it is to have something attractive on the front page of that flyer, is that you're willing to take a loss, because again, as we've said, Sean, if you got beef in the cart, you're going to have a whole lot of other stuff in the cart that's making you a margin.
Oh, I'm famous for that. My wife sends me to the grocery store with a list, and I always come with double. I'm throwing lots of additional stuff in the cart, and
yeah, well, that's what they want, and like I say, so that meat item on the front page, it's not netting them out anything, but it's designed as a destination item.
Hey, great stuff. You can find him at KevinGrier.com. Kevin, thanks a lot.
Always great to be on Real Agriculture, Sean. When I see you on call display, I clear the decks. Good to talk to you.
I appreciate it. That is Kevin Grier. He's with Kevin Grier Market Analysis and Consulting. Like I said, you can find him at KevinGrier.com.